The conference room in Washington, D.C. buzzed with quiet conversations as diplomats, trade officials, and policymakers shuffled through their papers. It was supposed to be another routine briefing about African markets and Chinese investments. The kind of meeting that happens dozens of times each year, where statistics are shared, concerns are raised, and everyone goes home feeling like they've done their job. But Dr. Chen Wei wasn't there to deliver statistics. The 52-year-old economist from Beijing had spent the last 15 years living and working across Africa, from the bustling streets of Lagos to the copper mines of Zambia. His weathered face and calloused hands told a different story than most Chinese officials who visited Washington. This wasn't a man who knew Africa from boardrooms and five-star hotels. When Chen stood to speak, something in his manner made the room fall silent. He didn't use a PowerPoint presentation or rely on carefully prepared talking points. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph of a young African girl standing next to a newly built school. "Her name is Amara," Chen began, his English accented but clear. 3 years ago, she walked 12 kilometers each day to attend classes in a building with no roof and no books. Today, she studies computer programming in a facility that has solar power, internet access, and a library filled with thousands of books in both English and her local language. The American officials exchanged glances. They had expected to hear about trade deals and infrastructure loans, not personal stories about individual children, Chen continued. But what you need to understand is why this matters to your country's future. Not just hers. He paused, letting his words sink in. Because while American leaders have been debating whether to engage with Africa, China has been building relationships that will define global economics for the next century. Senator Margaret Harrison, who had been checking her phone, looked up sharply. She had been tracking Chinese influence in Africa for months, growing increasingly concerned about America's diminishing role on the continent. But something about Chen's tone suggested he wasn't here to boast about China's success. "For 15 years, I have watched my government make the same mistake your government is making now," Chen said, his voice growing more intense. "We see Africa as a place to extract resources and expand influence. But Africa is not a chess piece in a global game. It is 54 nations filled with brilliant people who are solving problems that the rest of the world will face tomorrow." The room was completely silent now. Even the note-takers had stopped writing. Chen walked closer to the conference table, making eye contact with each person. "Last month, I visited a farm in Kenya where a young engineer named Joseph has developed an irrigation system that uses 60% less water than traditional methods. His innovation could help feed millions of people as climate change makes farming more difficult. But do you know who is funding his research?" He didn't wait for an answer. "It's not China. It's not America. It's a partnership between Kenyan universities and Norwegian scientists, because they recognize something that both our governments have missed." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a State Department advisor, leaned forward. "And what's that?" "That Africa doesn't need to be saved or controlled," Chen replied. "It needs to be respected as an equal partner, and whichever country figures that out first will have allies for the next 100 years. Chen returned to his seat, but the energy in the room had completely changed. These weren't just policy discussions anymore. This was about America's place in a world where traditional power structures were shifting faster than anyone had anticipated. "I came here today because I believe America has something unique to offer Africa," Chen continued. "Your tradition of innovation, your universities, your entrepreneurial spirit. But you're so focused on competing with China that you're missing the real opportunity." Representative David Torres, who had been skeptical about the meeting from the start, found himself genuinely curious. "What opportunity?" Chen smiled for the first time since he had started speaking. "The opportunity to learn. In Ghana, I met a programmer who created an app that helps farmers predict weather patterns using locally sourced data. In Rwanda, a team of engineers developed a drone delivery system that gets medical supplies to remote villages faster than any road network could. In South Africa, researchers are working on energy storage solutions that could revolutionize how the world uses renewable power." He paused, looking around the room again. "These innovations aren't happening because of Chinese investment or American aid. They're happening because African minds are solving African problems, and those solutions often work better than anything designed in Beijing or Silicon Valley." The implications were beginning to dawn on several people in the room. If Africa was becoming a center of innovation, rather than just a source of raw materials, then America's entire approach to the continent needed to change. So what are you suggesting? Senator Harrison asked. Chen's expression grew serious again. I'm suggesting that both our countries need to stop thinking about Africa as a place to do business and start thinking about it as a place to build the future. Because whether you realize it or not, that's already happening. The only question is whether America wants to be part of it. The meeting was scheduled to last 1 hour. It went on for 3. And by the time Chen Wei walked out of that conference room, he had planted an idea that would change how some of the most powerful people in America thought about an entire continent. Within 48 hours of Chen Wei's presentation, Senator Margaret Harrison was on a secure phone line with the Secretary of State. The conversation that followed would spark a chain reaction across Washington's foreign policy establishment. Margaret, I've been getting calls all morning about this Chinese economist, Secretary Williams said, her voice tight with concern. Half the people who were in that room are telling me we need to completely rethink our Africa strategy. Harrison stared out her office window at the Capitol dome, Chen's words still echoing in her mind. Linda, I've been working on African policy for 8 years and I thought I understood what we were dealing with. But this man presented evidence that everything we think we know is outdated. The evidence Chen had shared wasn't classified intelligence or secret trade data. It was publicly available information that no one in Washington had been paying attention to. African universities were publishing research at rates that rivaled European institutions. African tech companies were solving problems that Silicon Valley hadn't even identified yet. African entrepreneurs were creating businesses that served not just local markets but global ones. Give me specifics, the secretary demanded. Harrison flipped through her notes from the meeting. Nigeria has more registered software companies than Canada. Kenya's mobile payment system is more advanced than anything we have in the United States. Ethiopia is manufacturing electronics that are being exported to Europe. And we're still talking about Africa like it's 1985. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. The Chinese know this, Harrison continued. But according to Chen, they're making the same mistakes we are. They're building infrastructure and extracting resources, but they're not actually partnering with African innovators. They're treating Africa like a client, not like an equal. Secretary Williams was taking notes now. What's Chen's angle? Why is he telling us this? That's what worries me, Harrison admitted. He said he's concerned about his own government's approach. He thinks China is missing the biggest opportunity in modern history because they're too focused on traditional power dynamics. What Harrison didn't mention was the private conversation she'd had with Chen after the official meeting ended. He had shared something that made her blood run cold. Chen had shown her economic projections suggesting that by 2040, Sub-Saharan Africa would have a larger middle class than Europe and North America combined. Not because of aid or foreign investment, but because of internal innovation and entrepreneurship that was already happening. If these numbers are even close to accurate, Chen had said quietly, then whoever builds genuine partnerships with African leaders today will have the strongest allies in the world's largest consumer market tomorrow. Now, sitting in her Senate office, Harrison was trying to figure out how to explain this to colleagues who still thought of Africa primarily as a place that needed humanitarian assistance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Representative Torres, who had also been at the Chen briefing. Just got off a call with my Foreign Affairs Committee staff. They want to schedule hearings about our Africa policy. This is moving fast. It was moving fast because the implications were staggering. If Africa was on the verge of an economic boom driven by local innovation, then American foreign policy was positioned to miss the most important economic shift of the 21st century. Harrison's chief of staff knocked on her door. Senator, you have 3 more calls holding. 2 from committee chairs and 1 from the Pentagon. The Pentagon call surprised her. Colonel James Matthews was a strategic planning officer she'd worked with on various security issues, but never anything related to Africa. Margaret, I need to ask you about this briefing yesterday, Matthews said without preamble. We're getting reports that suggest the Chinese economists shared information that contradicts our intelligence assessments about African capabilities. What kind of contradictions? Our analysts have been tracking Chinese military and economic activities in Africa, based on the assumption that African nations are primarily dependent on foreign support, Matthews explained. But if these countries are developing independent technological capabilities at the rate this Chen fellow suggested, then our strategic assessments are fundamentally flawed. Harrison felt a chill. Military planning was based on understanding the capabilities and intentions of all parties in a region. If American strategists had been underestimating African technological and economic development, then security projections for the entire continent might be wrong. Colonel, are you saying our military planning has been based on outdated assumptions? I'm saying we need to find out. And fast. After the Pentagon call, Harrison sat alone in her office staring at a map of Africa on her wall. For years, she had looked at that map and seen countries that needed American assistance and protection from Chinese influence. But now she was beginning to see something different. 54 nations that might be developing capabilities that neither America nor China fully understood. Her secure phone rang again. This time it was David Chen himself. Senator Harrison, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. Your staff gave me this number. Dr. Chen, I was hoping to speak with you again. Your presentation yesterday has generated quite a response. I imagine it has. That was my intention. His voice was serious. Senator, I need you to understand something. The information I shared yesterday represents only a small portion of what I've observed during my time in Africa. There are developments happening across the continent that will reshape global economics and security within the next decade. Harrison felt her pulse quicken. What kinds of developments? The kind that require immediate attention from American leaders who care about their country's future influence in the world, Chen replied. I have documentation of innovations and partnerships that I believe your government needs to see. But this information is sensitive, and I'm not sure your current intelligence networks are equipped to verify what I'm telling you. Are you offering to share intelligence with the United States government? I'm offering to share truth with people who can act on it, Chen said. Because, Senator, whether America chooses to engage with African nations as equals or continues to treat them as aid recipients will determine whether your grandchildren live in a world where America is a leading power or a declining. The line went quiet for a moment. Dr. Chen, I think we need to arrange another meeting. A much more comprehensive one. I was hoping you would say that, Senator, because what I showed you yesterday was just the beginning. The secure facility in Virginia was not the kind of place where most foreign nationals were invited to share information with American intelligence officials. But Dr. Chen Wei was not most foreign nationals, and the information he brought with him was unlike anything the CIA had seen regarding African development. Deputy Director Patricia Cole had been skeptical when Senator Harrison requested this unusual briefing. A Chinese economist wanting to share sensitive information about Africa with American officials sounded like the setup for an intelligence operation. But the preliminary verification of Chen's Washington presentation had yielded disturbing conclusions. American intelligence agencies had been systematically underestimating African technological and economic development for over a decade. Dr. Chen, Deputy Director Cole began, before we proceed, I need to understand your motivations for sharing this information. Chen opened a leather briefcase and removed a thick folder. Deputy Director, my motivations are quite simple. I believe both my government and yours are making strategic errors that will have devastating consequences for global stability. He placed the first document on the table. It was a detailed analysis of African universities' research output over the past 5 years. The numbers were staggering. Nigerian universities were publishing more peer-reviewed papers in computer science than most European countries. South African medical research was being cited by journals worldwide. Kenyan agricultural innovations were being adopted by farmers in Asia and South America. Your intelligence assessments treat African nations as technology importers, Chen continued. But the reality is that they have become technology innovators, and neither China nor America is paying attention to the implications. Agent Sarah Kim, a specialist in economic intelligence, studied the documents Chen was distributing. Dr. Chen, these research numbers suggest that African universities are producing innovations at a rate comparable to developed nations. That contradicts our understanding of educational infrastructure across most of the continent. Chen nodded grimly. That's exactly my point. Your understanding is based on data that's 10 years old. While American and Chinese officials have been focused on traditional metrics like GDP and infrastructure spending, African institutions have been building knowledge economies that operate differently than anything we've seen before. The next document made Deputy Director Cole sit back in her chair. It was a comprehensive list of African companies that were providing technological services to clients in Europe, Asia, and North America. Software firms in Ghana were handling data processing for British banks. Engineering companies in Rwanda were designing renewable energy systems for clients in Germany. Kenyan financial technology firms were consulting for major American corporations. This is happening right now, Cole asked. This is happening right now, Chen confirmed, and it's accelerating. But here's what should really concern you. He pulled out another file. These companies aren't just serving foreign clients. They're building networks with each other across the continent. The implications hit Agent Kim immediately. They're creating an integrated African technology sector. Exactly. While everyone has been watching Chinese infrastructure projects and worrying about debt diplomacy, African entrepreneurs have been building something much more significant. An independent innovation economy that doesn't depend on foreign assistance or investment. Chen showed them photographs from his travels across Africa. Research facilities that looked like they belonged in Silicon Valley. Manufacturing plants using cutting-edge automation. Universities where students were working on artificial intelligence projects that rivaled anything being done in Beijing or Boston. Dr. Chen, Deputy Director Cole said carefully, why is a Chinese official showing us evidence that African nations are developing independent capabilities? Chen was quiet for a long moment. Because, Deputy Director, I have spent 15 years watching my government make the same mistakes that led to China being underestimated by Western powers for decades. We assumed that economic development followed predictable patterns. We assumed that technological innovation required specific types of institutional structures. We assumed that we understood how progress happens. He pulled out a final document. This is a projection that I prepared for my superiors in Beijing 6 months ago. They rejected it as unrealistic. The paper detailed Chen's prediction that by 2035, Africa would be home to more technology companies than Europe, more engineering graduates than North America, and more patents per capita than any region except East Asia. They rejected it because it contradicts everything we think we know about economic development, Chen continued. But Deputy Director, I have seen these companies. I have met these engineers. I have visited these universities. This isn't a projection. It's already happening. Agent Kim was studying satellite imagery that Chen had included in his materials. These are photos of industrial complexes? In Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, Chen confirmed. Manufacturing facilities that are producing goods for export to global markets. Many of them are using automation and artificial intelligence, systems that were designed by African engineers. Deputy Director Cole felt a familiar sensation that she experienced whenever intelligence assessments needed to be fundamentally revised. Dr. Chen, if your analysis is correct, then American foreign policy toward Africa is not just outdated. It's counterproductive. That's exactly right, Chen replied. While America has been offering aid and debt relief, African nations have been building the foundation for becoming major economic powers. Your assistance programs are designed for countries that need help, but you're dealing with countries that are becoming competitors. The room fell silent as the full implications became clear. American aid programs, trade policies, and diplomatic strategies were all based on the assumption that African nations were developing economies that needed guidance and support. But if Chen was right, then those nations were actually emerging economies that would soon be in direct competition with established powers. There's something else, Chen said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. My government has reached the same conclusion I have, but they're responding differently. How so? They're changing their strategy from infrastructure investment to technology acquisition. China is no longer trying to build influence in Africa through loans and construction projects. They're trying to buy African technology companies and recruit African scientists to work in Chinese institutions. Deputy Director Cole felt her pulse quicken. Are you saying China is attempting to acquire African intellectual property? I'm saying China recognizes that African innovation is becoming strategically important, and they want to control it rather than compete with it, Chen replied. Which means America needs to decide quickly whether it wants to be a partner with African innovators or a spectator to their success. The briefing was scheduled to last 2 hours. It went on for 6. And by the time Dr. Chen Wei left the Virginia facility, American intelligence agencies were beginning the largest reassessment of African capabilities in their history. 3 weeks after the Virginia briefing, CIA analyst Marcus Rodriguez was working late in his Langley office, cross-referencing Chen's claims with intelligence databases. What he discovered at 2:17 a.m. would change everything. American intelligence thought they knew about global technology development. Rodriguez had been tasked with verifying Chen's most explosive claim that African technology companies were not just serving local markets, but were becoming essential providers for major corporations worldwide. What started as routine verification had turned into the most significant intelligence discovery of his career. "Holy shit," Rodriguez whispered to his empty office as data streamed across his monitors. The initial search had been straightforward. Rodriguez was looking for evidence of African technology companies in global supply chains. But what he found was far more extensive than Chen had indicated. African firms weren't just providing basic services to foreign companies. They were developing critical technologies that major corporations depended on. A software company in Lagos had created algorithms that were being used by 3 of the largest European banks to detect fraudulent transactions. A Kenyan firm had developed satellite data analysis tools that American agricultural companies were using to optimize crop yields. A South African company had designed cybersecurity protocols that were protecting critical infrastructure across multiple continents. But the discovery that made Rodriguez call his supervisor at 2:30 a.m. was buried deep in procurement records that most analysts never bothered to examine. "Tom, you need to get in here," Rodriguez said when his boss answered the phone. "I found something that changes everything." Deputy Director of Analysis Thomas Bennett had worked in intelligence for 25 years. He wasn't easily impressed by late-night discoveries. But when he arrived at Rodriguez's office 30 minutes later, the data on the screens made him grab a chair and sit down hard. "Marcus, tell me you've verified this." "I've triple-checked it," Rodriguez replied. "Tom, remember how we've been tracking Chinese technology acquisitions in Africa? We assumed they were buying raw material suppliers and basic manufacturing companies." "Right. Standard resource acquisition strategy." Rodriguez turned to his primary monitor. "That's not what they're doing. Look at this." He pulled up a list of Chinese acquisitions of African companies over the past 2 years. They're not buying mining companies or agricultural firms. They're buying the technology companies that Chen told us about. Bennett studied the list. Chinese corporations had acquired or invested in over 200 African technology firms in the past 24 months. Software developers, engineering consultancies, biotechnology firms, renewable energy companies, artificial intelligence researchers. Jesus, Marcus. They're not trying to extract resources from Africa. They're trying to extract brainpower. "It gets worse," Rodriguez continued. He opened another file. "I cross-referenced these acquisitions with patent filings. Tom, the technologies that these African companies developed are now being filed as Chinese patents." The implications were staggering. China wasn't just investing in African innovation. They were acquiring it, rebranding it, and claiming ownership of intellectual property that had been developed by African scientists and engineers. Bennett was taking notes rapidly. "What's the scale of this?" Rodriguez pulled up another screen. "Based on patent filings and acquisition records, Chinese companies have acquired rights to African innovations worth an estimated $47 billion in potential intellectual property value. And most of the African companies that sold their rights used that money to develop new technologies, which China will probably try to acquire as well." "Already happening," Rodriguez confirmed. "I found evidence of Chinese firms approaching African companies with offers to buy technologies that haven't even been completed yet. They're essentially paying African innovators to work for Chinese corporations without the African companies realizing what's happening." Bennett stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the Virginia countryside was dark except for the security lights around the CIA complex. "Marcus, if Chen is right about the scale of African innovation, and if China is systematically acquiring that innovation, then China is building technological advantages using African intellectual property, while American policymakers still think of Africa as a place that needs aid." Rodriguez finished. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the implications. "There's more," Rodriguez said finally. I found something that suggests American companies are missing opportunities that could be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. He opened a new set of files. Remember Chen mentioned African solutions to problems that American companies haven't solved yet? I found 17 examples of African innovations that directly address challenges facing major American industries. Rodriguez showed Bennett documentation of African companies that had developed more efficient solar panel designs, created water purification systems that worked in extreme conditions, designed medical diagnostic tools that functioned without expensive infrastructure, and built communication networks that operated reliably in areas with limited connectivity. Tom, American companies are spending billions of dollars trying to solve these exact problems, and the solutions already exist in African laboratories and engineering firms. Bennett was taking more notes. What's preventing American companies from accessing these innovations? Two things, Rodriguez replied. First, American business intelligence networks don't monitor African markets effectively. Our corporate executives don't know these solutions exist. Second, American trade and diplomatic policies make it difficult for African companies to form partnerships with American firms. Rodriguez pulled up a final screen, but Chinese policies make it easy for Chinese companies to acquire African innovations. While American corporations are struggling to solve problems that African engineers have already solved, Chinese firms are buying those solutions and using them to outcompete American companies in global markets. The room fell silent again. Marcus, I need you to prepare a comprehensive briefing for the director, Bennett said finally. This goes to the top of the priority list. Already working on it, Rodriguez replied. But Tom, there's something else Chen told us that I couldn't verify until tonight. What? He said this was just the beginning. That African innovation was accelerating faster than anyone realized. Rodriguez turned back to his computer. I found evidence that he's right. The number of technology companies being established in Africa is doubling every 18 months. The number of patents being filed by African inventors has increased by 400% in the past 3 years. The amount of venture capital being invested in African startups has grown by 600% since 2020. Bennett was writing furiously now. So Chen's projection about Africa becoming a major technology center by 2035 might be conservative, Rodriguez said. Based on current growth rates, Africa could become one of the world's primary sources of technological innovation within the next decade. And if Chinese companies continue acquiring that innovation, while American companies remain unaware it exists, Bennett didn't need Rodriguez to finish the sentence. America could find itself technologically outcompeted by China, using innovations that American companies never knew existed. The two analysts worked until sunrise, preparing what would become one of the most important intelligence assessments in CIA history. By the time they finished, they had documented a shift in global innovation patterns that challenged every assumption American policymakers held about economic development, technological advancement, and international competition. When Bennett finally left Rodriguez's office at 6 a.m., he carried with him a classified report that would reach the president's desk within 72 hours. President Sarah Mitchell had seen thousands of intelligence briefings during her time in office, but the report she was reading in the Oval Office made her cancel her morning meetings and call an emergency session with her national security team. The implications of what CIA analysts had discovered about African innovation and Chinese acquisition strategies were too significant to handle through normal policy channels. Director Santos, the president said as CIA Director Maria Santos entered the Oval Office. I need you to tell me that this report is exaggerated. Santos sat across from the president, her expression grim. Madam President, our analysts have verified every major claim in that assessment. If anything, we believe the scope of the situation may be larger than what we've documented. The president set the classified folder on her desk. Maria, this report suggests that American foreign policy toward an entire continent has been based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions for over a decade. That's correct, Madam President, and that while we've been treating African nations like aid recipients, they've been developing technological capabilities that rival developed economies. Also correct, and that China has been systematically acquiring these capabilities while American companies remain completely unaware they exist. Director Santos nodded. Madam President, Based on current trends, Chinese corporations will own intellectual property rights to African innovations worth an estimated $200 billion within the next 5 years. Meanwhile, American companies are spending billions trying to develop solutions to problems that African engineers have already solved. The president stood and walked to the windows overlooking the rose garden. Maria, how did our intelligence agencies miss something this significant? Madam President, our assessment protocols were designed during an era when technological innovation followed predictable patterns. We assumed that advanced research happened in established institutions in developed countries. We didn't anticipate that universities and companies in developing economies could leapfrog traditional development stages. But this Chinese economist, Dr. Chen, he saw it. Yes, Madam President. Chen spent 15 years working directly with African institutions. He observed developments that our satellite imagery and economic data couldn't detect. The president returned to her chair. And he shared this information with us because he's concerned about Chinese strategy? According to our assessment, Chen believes both Chinese and American policies toward Africa are strategically misguided. But he's particularly concerned that Chinese acquisition of African intellectual property will create technological dependencies that destabilize global innovation systems. The intercom buzzed. Madam President, your national security team is assembled. The president looked at Director Santos. Maria, I need you to present this briefing to the full team. But first, I need to understand the immediate implications. If this assessment is accurate, what should American policy be? Director Santos opened her briefing folder. Madam President, we've identified 3 critical options. First, America could attempt to compete with China by offering better terms for acquiring African innovations. Second, America could pivot to treating African nations as equal partners in technological development, rather than aid recipients. Third, America could ignore these developments and hope they don't significantly impact global competitiveness. What do you recommend? Madam President, option 3 is not viable. These developments are accelerating too rapidly to ignore. Option 1 is problematic because it essentially accepts that African innovations should be controlled by foreign powers rather than African institutions. Option 2 requires a fundamental reorganization of American foreign policy toward Africa, but it offers the possibility of genuine partnerships that benefit both American and African interests. The president was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications. Maria, if we pursue option 2, what would that look like practically? It would mean replacing aid programs with technology partnerships. It would mean American universities collaborating with African universities as equals. It would mean American companies forming joint ventures with African companies rather than trying to acquire them. It would mean treating African nations as potential allies in technological competition with China, rather than as markets for American products. The president's chief of staff knocked and entered. Madam President, the national security team is ready. As they walked toward the situation room, the president asked one more question. Maria, in your professional opinion, how much time do we have to make this decision? Madam President, based on current acquisition rates, China will control access to most African technological innovations within 2 years. If America is going to establish genuine partnerships with African institutions, we need to begin immediately. The situation room was filled with the highest levels of American national security leadership. Secretary of State Williams, Defense Secretary Johnson, National Economic Council Director Chen, and several other senior officials sat around the table as Director Santos began her presentation. The reaction was immediate and intense. This can't be accurate, Defense Secretary Johnson said after Santos finished her opening summary. Our defense intelligence assessments show African military capabilities that are entirely dependent on foreign suppliers. Mr. Secretary, Santos replied, your assessments are correct about military hardware. But this briefing is about civilian technological capabilities that have defense applications. African companies are developing cybersecurity tools, satellite communication systems, and artificial intelligence applications that could be militarily significant. Secretary of State Williams was reading through the supporting documents. Maria, if these economic projections are accurate, then our entire diplomatic strategy toward Africa needs to be reconsidered. Madam Secretary, that's exactly right. National Economic Council Director Chen was studying the patent acquisition data. This suggests that American companies are being systematically outmaneuvered in global technology markets without realizing it's happening. The president listened to the discussion for 30 minutes before calling for order. I need specific recommendations. If we accept that this assessment is accurate, what concrete steps should America take immediately? Director Santos referred to her notes. First, we need to establish direct communication channels with African technology leaders. Second, we need to revise our trade policies to make partnerships with African companies easier for American firms. Third, we need to restructure our foreign aid programs to support collaborative research rather than dependency-creating assistance. Fourth, Secretary Williams added, we need to completely revise our diplomatic approach to African nations. We need to start engaging with them as emerging technological powers rather than as developing economies. The president looked around the table. I want implementation plans for all of these recommendations within 1 week. But first I want to meet with Dr. Chen again. Madam President? Director Santos asked. This Chinese economist has been right about developments that our entire intelligence apparatus missed. I want to hear his assessment of what happens next. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, but the fundamental decision had been made. American policy toward Africa would change more dramatically than it had in decades, all because of information shared by a Chinese man who believed that both superpowers were making strategic errors that could destabilize global economics. As the national security team filed out of the Situation Room, the president remained behind with Director Santos. Maria, there's something I need to know. Why did Chen really share this information with us? Director Santos had been expecting this question. Madam President, our assessment is that Chen believes technological innovation works best in competitive, collaborative environments. He thinks Chinese acquisition strategies will stifle African innovation by removing competitive pressures and collaborative opportunities, so he wants America to compete with China in Africa. Not to help America, but to help Africa? That's our assessment, yes. The president was quiet for a moment. Maria, that might be the most sophisticated geopolitical strategy I've ever encountered. Chen is manipulating 2 superpowers into competing for African partnerships because he believes that competition will produce better outcomes for African innovators. Yes, Madam President. And if he's right, everyone wins except the superpower that chooses not to compete effectively. The president smiled grimly. Then we'd better make sure we compete effectively. 6 months after Dr. Chen Wei's first presentation in Washington, President Mitchell stood in a conference room in Lagos, Nigeria, surrounded by African technology leaders, American executives, and government officials from 12 nations. The gathering represented the most significant shift in American-African relations since the end of the Cold War, and it had all started with one Chinese man's decision to tell American leaders an uncomfortable truth. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, the Nigerian computer scientist who had become the informal spokesperson for African technology leaders, addressed the assembled group. 6 months ago, most of our American colleagues had never heard of African innovation centers. Today we are launching partnerships that will define technological development for the next generation. President Mitchell nodded as Dr. Okonkwo spoke. The transformation had been remarkable. After the president's direct meeting with Dr. Chen, American policy toward Africa had changed faster than anyone thought possible. Trade barriers that had prevented African companies from partnering with American firms were eliminated. University exchange programs were expanded to include African institutions as equal participants. American companies were encouraged to form joint ventures with African innovators rather than simply purchasing their technologies. The results had exceeded everyone's expectations. Joseph Kimani, the Kenyan engineer Chen had mentioned in his first presentation, was now working with 3 American agricultural companies to implement his water-efficient,